The rain over D.C. was thick and gray, a suffocating shroud that swallowed the marble monuments in a cold, unforgiving mist. Inside St. Jude's, the air smelled of stale incense and old wax until 9:14 p.m., when the heavy oak doors groaned open. Sia Rhee stumbled in, her designer silk dress shredded and stained with a blooming shade of scarlet. She looked less like a socialite and more like a ghost seeking a place to die. She didn't head for the altar. She collapsed into the shadows of the third confessional, her trembling hand leaving a bloody smear on the wood. "Father," she whispered, her voice cracking through the darkness. "I have a list." Behind the screen, Father Nico Abate sat in a silence, so profound it felt like a physical weight. He had spent 20 years trying to wash the scent of iron from his hands, trading the Abate throne for a life of liturgy and quiet penance. But as the rhythmic, wet sound of Sia's labored breathing filled the boxy sanctuary, the beast he had starved for 2 decades began to stir. Nico leaned closer to the lattice, his eyes adjusting to the dim amber glow. He noticed her hand trembling against the wooden ledge, clutching a vintage silver locket, the only thing on her person that didn't belong to her father's meticulously curated brand. Through the filigree, he caught a glimpse of a faded photo, a woman with the same tired, elegant eyes as Sia, a mother who had slipped away years ago in a house that was far too quiet. There were no siblings in the frame, no chaotic family snapshots, just Sia, standing alone in the center of a perfectly staged life. When she finally looked toward the screen, her expression wasn't that of a daughter missing the comfort of home. It was the hollow, desperate look of a prisoner who had finally found a hole in the fence. "They think I'm a liability," she choked out, her fingers digging into the velvet cushion. "My father, he didn't look away, Father." He held the door shut. He watched Julian Vane and the others. He watched them break me, and then he negotiated the price of my silence. Nico's eyes, usually softened by the practiced compassion of a shepherd, sharpened into the predatory focus of an apex predator. A father who brokered the destruction of his own child was a sin that no amount of prayer could cleanse. He memorized the names she whispered, billionaires, lobbyists, the Gilded Circle, not as a confessor, but as a bookkeeper of debts. Nico reached up, his fingers brushing against the stiff white clerical collar. With a slow, deliberate motion, he unfastened it. As the plastic tab came away, the light caught the dark, intricate ink creeping up his neck, the crowns of thorns and barbed wire of the Abate syndicate. He had taken vows to protect the soul, but he had been born into a family that protected the body with iron and fire. "The Lord offers forgiveness, Sia," Nico murmured, his voice dropping into a low, lethal vibration that echoed through the dark nave. "But I am still a son of my father, and an Abate never leaves a debt unpaid." He reached into the hidden pocket of his cassock and retrieved a burner phone. As the screen's blue glow illuminated his face, the transition was final. The shepherd was gone. The wolf had returned to the fold. The 72-hour clock had begun to tick. The first 24 hours did not begin with a bang, but with the quiet, clinical efficiency of a predator reclaiming its territory. While the morning sun struggled to pierce the gray DC canopy, Father Nico sat in the rectory, his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. On the mahogany desk before him, the burner phone vibrated. A single, sharp buzz that signaled the ghost in the machine had awakened. The first name on Sia's list was Julian Vane, a billionaire real estate mogul and a primary donor to her father's re-election campaign. To the public, Vane was a philanthropist. To the woman bleeding in the confessional, he was the man who had used his wealth to buy her silence, while his hands left bruises that money couldn't heal. By 8 p.m., the National Portrait Gallery was transformed into a sea of silk, champagne, and forced smiles for the annual Founders Gala. Julian Vane was in his element, holding court near a towering marble bust, his laughter booming over the string quartet. He felt untouchable, shielded by the presence of a private security detail and the unspoken immunity of the Gilded Circle. He didn't notice the man in the catering uniform who moved with a grace too disciplined for a waiter, nor did he see the black sedan idling at the service entrance, its plates registered to a holding company that hadn't existed since the Abate family went underground. Nico's network didn't operate with the messy bravado of street gangs. They were the silence between heartbeats, the shadows that shifted when no one was looking. The disappearance was a masterclass in invisibility. Vane had stepped onto the terrace for a private call, the glowing tip of his cigar the only marker of his position in the evening mist. He didn't even have time to shout. A gloved hand, a pressurized sedative, and the weight of 20 years of repressed Abate fury descended upon him in an instant. When his assistant went to check on him 5 minutes later, only the cigar remained, smoldering against the stone railing like a dying star. There was no struggle, no blood, and no witnesses, only a sudden, vacuum-like absence where a powerful man had stood. Back at the church, Nico stood before the altar, the candlelight flickering against the sharp, ink-marked angles of his neck. He wasn't praying for Vane's soul, he was contemplating the mathematics of justice. By the time the gala guests began to notice the billionaire's seat was empty, Vane was already miles away, bound in the basement of a disused warehouse where the damp air smelled of river salt and impending reckoning. Nico checked his watch. The Gilded Circle would soon realize that the law was a paper shield against a monster who had once been a god. The hunt was moving into its second phase, and Julian Vane was merely the first debt to be collected in full. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass of the rectory in bruised purples and deep reds, but Sia didn't feel the warmth. She sat at the small wooden table, her eyes glued to the flickering television screen as a news anchor reported the mysterious disappearance of Julian Vane from the Founders' Gala. The police were baffled. The senator was calling it a national security crisis. Sia felt a cold tremor run down her spine, not of fear, but of a dizzying, sudden realization. She had whispered that name in the dark of the confessional only 12 hours ago. She had expected a prayer, a referral to the authorities, or perhaps a hidden place to stay. She had never expected the world to simply swallow the man whole. She looked across the room at Father Nico. He was standing by the window, silhouetted against the light, his back to her as he poured a cup of tea. He looked like an ordinary priest, composed, humble, and draped in the heavy black of his vocation. But as he reached for a spoon, his sleeve pulled back just an inch, revealing a sliver of dark, jagged ink on his wrist. Sia's breath hitched. In the sanctuary of the booth, she had been too broken to notice the details, but now, the dots were beginning to connect with terrifying speed. "You didn't call the police," she whispered, the television providing a frantic backdrop to her low voice. "I gave you a list of the most powerful men in this city, and you didn't go to the FBI. You went to the dark." Nico turned slowly. The soft, pastoral mask he wore for the congregation didn't slip, it simply dissolved. His eyes weren't those of a man who spent his days in prayer, but of a man who knew exactly how much pressure it took to break a human spirit. He didn't deny it. He didn't offer a platitude about God's justice. He simply set the tea down with a click that sounded like a hammer cocking on a pistol. "You came to St. Jude's for a reason, Sia," he said, his voice a calm, lethal vibration. "Perhaps you thought it was faith, but your soul knew exactly what kind of sanctuary it needed. You didn't need a priest to forgive your father. You needed a monster to stop him." Sia looked at the ink on his neck, the crown of thorns that looked more like a warning than a religious symbol, and then back at the news report of the billionaire's vanishing. The gentle shepherd she had run to was a myth. She had accidentally stumbled into the arms of the one man the Gilded Circle couldn't buy, because he belonged to a family that had owned the shadows long before the senator learned how to use them. A strange, fierce calm settled over her. She wasn't horrified. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something that felt like power. She reached for the remote, turned off the news, and looked him in the eye. "Julian Vane was just the architect of the money," she said firmly. "If you're going to be the monster, I'll be the one who draws the map." Senator Lawrence Rhee sat in his study, surrounded by portraits of himself. He didn't look at the empty chair where his late wife once sat, nor did he think of the child he had groomed like a pedigree horse. To him, Sia was no longer a daughter to be loved. She was a vault of secrets that had walked out the front door. With no other heirs to complicate the legacy and no meddling mother to protect her, the senator realized with a chilling calm that her disappearance could be spun as a tragedy, provided he silenced her before she spoke. Senator Lawrence Rhee was a man whose career was built on the strategic orchestration of noise, applause, campaign slogans, and the frantic whispers of backroom deals, so the sudden disappearance of his daughter was a void he couldn't fill with rhetoric. By the second morning, the senator's private study in his Colorama mansion had been transformed into a cold, efficient command center. He paced the length of the Persian rug, his face a mask of practiced concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. To the public, he was the grieving father of a kidnapped socialite. To the men in the room, he was a client demanding the recovery of a compromised asset before it could speak. "I want every camera within a 10-block radius of her last known coordinates scrubbed," Lawrence barked, pointing a trembling finger at the commander of the Metropolitan Police and the lead FBI liaison. "She didn't just vanish. Use the Patriot Act protocols. Check the morgues, the hospitals, and every low-rent motel from here to the coast. He was using the full weight of the state as his personal bloodhound, unleashing the state's shadow to hunt down a girl whose only crime was surviving. He was unaware that the scent had been cold for hours, buried beneath the consecrated ground of a man who knew exactly how to make a person cease to exist. 5 miles away, Father Nico watched the morning news on a small, grainy television in the church basement, the volume turned to a low hum. On the screen, the senator was giving a televised plea, his voice breaking with scripted emotion. Nico's lip curled in a silent, predatory sneer. Beside him, Sia sat wrapped in an oversized wool sweater, watching her father's performance with a clinical, detached coldness. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a witness waiting for the jury to reach a verdict. Nico didn't look away from the screen, but his fingers moved with practiced speed across an encrypted laptop. He wasn't praying, he was executing Abate protocols. With a series of keystrokes, he rerouted the digital pings from Sia's cloned SIM card, sending them bouncing through a sequence of relay towers in Baltimore and Northern Virginia. He watched the state's shadow scramble, dispatching tactical teams to empty warehouses and industrial docks while Sia sat 10 feet beneath a hidden altar. The senator was hunting a daughter, but he was being led into a digital labyrinth designed by a man who had mastered the art of the ghost. Nico checked the burner phone. The third name on the list was already being shadowed. The hunt was moving into its next phase, and the senator's search was merely the background music to the coming collapse. The flickering candlelight in the basement of St. Jude's cast long, distorted shadows against the stone walls, pulling Nico's mind back to a night 20 years ago. A night where the air had smelled of gunpowder and expensive cologne instead of incense and damp concrete. Before the collar, before the quiet life of a neighborhood priest, there was only the iron-fisted rule of the Abate household. His father, Lorenzo Abate, had been a man who measured love in loyalty and respect in blood. Nico had been the golden heir, the one groomed to inherit a throne built on the bones of the city's forgotten, but the crown had always felt like a circlet of thorns. The beast had been born in those marble hallways, fed on the sight of men begging for lives they hadn't earned, and Nico had realized early on that to lead the family was to lose his soul piece by piece until nothing remained but the ink on his skin. The breaking point hadn't been a grand betrayal, but a moment of quiet, devastating clarity. He remembered standing in the rain outside a tenement building his father owned, watching a family being evicted in the dead of winter because they couldn't pay the protection tax. Lorenzo had stood beside him, lighting a cigar, his eyes cold and indifferent. "This is how we maintain the order, Nico," he had said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The weak are the fuel for our fire." That night, Nico had walked into his father's study, not with a weapon, but with a choice. He had laid his sigil ring on the desk, the heavy gold band that carried the family crest, and told the man who had raised him that he was dead to the Abate name. But you don't simply leave a family like the Abates. Lorenzo had looked at his son, not with anger, but with a terrifying, knowing smile. He had allowed Nico to take the vows of the church under one condition, a secret oath sworn on the blood of their ancestors. Nico could wear the collar, he could seek his redemption in the pews, but he would never truly be free of the Abate shadow. He had promised that if the innocent were ever truly threatened by the monsters the family couldn't control, the politicians, the predators, and the corrupt who operated above the law, he would return to the darkness to do what the light could not. Looking at Sia now, Nico felt the weight of that 20-year-old oath settling into his bones. He had spent 2 decades trying to wash the scent of iron from his hands, but as he traced the hidden tattoos beneath his shirt, he accepted the truth he had always known. He hadn't become a priest to escape the violence. He had become a priest to wait for the moment when that violence was finally holy. The debt he owed to the innocent was about to be paid in full. The 48-hour mark hit with the heavy, suffocating pressure of a storm that refused to break. In the high-walled corridors of power, the atmosphere had shifted from arrogant dismissal to a frantic, primal terror. Julian Vane's seat at the board meetings remained empty, and by noon, a second name on Sia's list, a high-ranking lobbyist known for his fixer reputation, had failed to return from his morning jog, leaving only a shattered fitness watch on a park trail. The remaining men, the architects of Sia's misery, were no longer concerned with public optics or political fallout. They were staring into a void that was systematically swallowing their world. The realization had finally set in. They weren't being blackmailed or investigated, they were being harvested. By late afternoon, the panic reached its fever pitch. Under the cover of a private security detail, the final 3 names on the list, men who had considered themselves the untouchable gods of DC, fled the city. They retreated to the Vault, a decommissioned Cold War-era bunker deep in the Virginia countryside, owned by a shell company tied to Sia's father. It was a fortress of reinforced concrete and steel, equipped with independent air filtration and biometric locks designed to withstand a nuclear strike. To these men, it was the ultimate sanctuary. To Nico Abate, it was a tomb with better plumbing. They sat in the sterile, fluorescent light of the bunker's lounge, clutching glasses of scotch with trembling hands, convinced that behind 3 feet of lead-lined doors, they were safe from whatever ghost was haunting their footsteps. They were unaware that the Abate family had never truly gone dormant. They had simply evolved into the very infrastructure these men relied on. The security firm that had vetted the bunker was an Abate subsidiary, and the technicians who had updated the biometric scanners weeks prior were men who still answered to the silent authority of the priest. While the senator's allies argued over who was next, Father Nico sat in the darkened sacristy of St. Jude's, a tablet glowing in his lap. He wasn't looking at a Bible, he was watching a live feed of the bunker's interior. He saw the sweat on their brows and the way they jumped at every hum of the ventilation system. With a single, precise keystroke, Nico initiated the compromise. In the bunker, the lights didn't flicker. They simply turned a deep, warning red. The heavy steel doors didn't jam. They locked with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid closing. The air filtration system began to cycle, but it wasn't pulling in fresh mountain air. It was recycling a mild, odorless sedative. Nico watched as the men realized, too late, that their fortress had become their trap. They pounded on the reinforced glass, their silent screams ignored by the cameras. There was no need for a messy breach. Nico had promised Sia that these men would cease to exist within 72 hours, and as he watched them slide into unconsciousness, he felt the cold satisfaction of a prophecy fulfilled. He closed the tablet and stood up, ready for the final name. The silence of the church was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a staging ground. Father Nico sat in the shadows of the choir loft, his eyes fixed on the final scrap of paper Sia had handed him 48 hours ago. The ink was slightly blurred from the moisture of her skin, but the name written there was as sharp as a razor. It was the name that had made his breath hitch, a name that didn't just carry wealth or political clout, but a kind of mythological invulnerability. This was the Grand Master of the Gilded Circle, the man who had bankrolled her father's rise, and held the strings of the very judges and generals Lawrence Rhee called friends. He was the architect of the senator's world, a figure so deeply embedded in the bedrock of the capital that Lawrence considered him unbeatable. To strike him wasn't just an act of vengeance, it was an act of war against the city's foundation. Nico felt the old Abate blood humming in his veins, a low-frequency vibration that signaled the approach of a final, decisive kill. He knew this man. In his previous life, before the collar and the vows, he had sat at tables where this individual's name was whispered with a reverence usually reserved for the divine. He was a man who didn't exist on paper, who used shadows the way Nico used light. For a moment, the priest in Nico felt a flicker of doubt, not for his ability to execute the task, but for the soul he would have to reclaim to do it. To reach an unbeatable man, he would have to become the monster he had spent 20 years trying to starve. He would have to fully embrace the Abate legacy, shedding the last remnants of the shepherd to become the wolf that the shepherd was born to be. Downstairs, Sia was waiting. She stood by the votive candles, her face illuminated by the flickering orange light. She saw the change in Nico before he even spoke. The calm, analytical priest was gone. In his place stood a man with a gaze of cold, tempered steel. "He thinks he's a ghost," Sia whispered, her voice reflecting the hard-edged transformation she was undergoing herself. "My father says he's the only one the law can't touch. That's why he's last. Because once he falls, the senator has nothing left but his own skin." Nico descended the stairs, his movements fluid and predatory, the heavy fabric of his cassock swirling around his boots like a dark tide. He stopped in front of her, the space between them charged with the electricity of a coming storm. He didn't offer her comfort. Instead, he reached out and adjusted the collar of her sweater, his fingers brushing against the ink on his own neck that was now fully visible in the dim light. "No one is unbeatable, Sia," he said, his voice a low, lethal rasp. "Some men just haven't met the right shadow yet." The 72-hour window was narrowing, and the unbeatable man was about to find out that even gods bleed when they are caught in the dark. Nico turned toward the door, ready to burn the senator's world to ash. The storm outside St. Jude's reached a violent crescendo, the wind howling through the bell tower like a choir of the damned. Inside the nave, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, metallic tang of readiness. The senator's men, a tactical recovery team masked as federal agents, didn't knock. They breached the heavy oak doors with a hydraulic ram, the wood splintering with a sound like a gunshot echoing through the holy silence. They moved with the clinical arrogance of men who believed they were the highest power in the city, their tactical lights cutting through the darkness, sweeping over the pews and the altar in search of a terrified girl and a defenseless priest. The senator's lead enforcer, a man whose soul had been bartered away long ago for a badge and a pension, stepped into the center aisle. He knew why they were here. The discovery had been a matter of digital forensics meeting old-world greed. While Nico had successfully diverted the FBI's pings across state lines, the senator's unbeatable grandmaster had utilized a private satellite grid to trace a single, microscopic anomaly, a surge in high-frequency data encrypted with Abate-era ciphers originating from a localized dead zone in the city's power grid, St. Jude's. The church hadn't been found through a slip-up, but through the sheer weight of the Abate legacy's digital footprint. They knew the priest was the source of the 72-hour harvest, and they had come to bury the source along with the witness. "Father Nico," the lead man barked, his voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling. "Hand over the Rhee girl, and maybe you'll keep your collar. We know it's you. We know what you've been doing from this basement." The only response was a low, resonant click, the sound of a safety being disengaged. Suddenly, the flickering votive candles died all at once, plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. These weren't the parish staff or the elderly deacons the senator had described. They were the Abate family's war machine, men who had spent 20 years in the deep freeze of the underworld, now reactivated with a single command from their heir. Muzzle flashes illuminated the sanctuary in jagged, strobe-like bursts. Nico didn't appear as a man of God. He moved through the chaos like a wraith, his black cassock billowing behind him as he systematically dismantled the intruders. He didn't use a rifle. He used the cold, surgical precision of a knife and the brutal efficiency of a man who had mastered the art of ending lives before he learned to save them. The senator's enforcers found themselves outclassed by a legacy of violence that predated their own birth. In the flashes of light, they saw glimpses of the ink on Nico's neck, the crown of thorns and barbed wire, and realized too late that the man they were hunting was the very beast their employer had warned them about. By the time the last of the senator's team fell, the church was silent again, the only sound the hiss of the rain through the broken doors. Nico stood over the lead enforcer, who was clutching a shattered shoulder. The priest reached down and grabbed the man's tactical radio. "Lawrence," Nico said, his voice a calm, lethal vibration. "Your men found the church, but they didn't find a priest. They found me, and now the sanctuary is closed." He dropped the radio and looked toward the choir loft, where Sia stood in the shadows, her eyes reflecting the dark, transformative power of the night. The breach was over, the light had failed to penetrate the darkness, and St. Jude's would never hold a mass again. The 72-hour window was almost shut, and the final reckoning was waiting at the threshold. The smoke from the tactical breach still hung in the air like a heavy, gray shroud, mingling with the scent of spent gunpowder and cold rain. Nico stood amidst the wreckage of the nave, his chest heaving with the rhythmic, controlled exertion of a man who had just reclaimed his birthright. He expected to find Sia trembling in the shadows of the choir loft, ready for the extraction he had meticulously planned. Instead, he found her sitting in the flickering blue light of the sub-basement's command center, her fingers moving across the keys with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. The liability was no longer waiting to be saved. She was beginning to rewrite the code of her own survival. "The car is ready, Sia," Nico said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp as he wiped a smear of blood from his cheek. "The senator knows where we are. This sanctuary is compromised. We need to move before the second wave arrives." Sia didn't look up. Her eyes were fixed on the flow of data, the hidden ledgers, the offshore accounts, and the complex web of blackmail that the Abate family had used to stay invisible for decades. "If I leave now, Nico, I'm just a ghost running from a shadow," she whispered, her voice carrying a new, tempered edge. She reached out and scrolled through a directory of encrypted files, her mind already cataloging the weaknesses in the Gilded Circle's infrastructure. "My father thinks he's hunting a daughter. He's wrong. He's created an enemy who knows exactly how his world breathes. I've found him. I've found the Grandmaster." Nico moved closer, watching as she bypassed a biometric firewall that had stymied his own hackers for years. She wasn't just surviving, she was executing a logic of erasure. She was systematically deleting the digital tethers that linked her to her old life, while simultaneously unearthing the financial skeletons of the men who had sought to bury her. She was using the Abate servers to peel back the layers of the city's foundation, exposing the rot beneath. "You have the muscle, Nico," she said, finally meeting his gaze with a terrifying clarity. The glassiness of trauma had been replaced by the sharp, analytical shimmer of a diamond. "But you need an architect for the light. I know where every secret is buried in DC, and I know how to make them scream." In that moment, the transformation was complete. She had shed the silk dress of the senator's daughter and stepped into the heavy, protective darkness of the Abate legacy. She wasn't just watching the final strike, she was the one opening the gates. Nico felt a cold, predatory pride settle in his chest. The 72-hour window was narrowing, and the unbeatable man was about to find out that his most dangerous secret had just learned how to fight back. Sia turned back to the screen, the blue light bathing her face as she initiated the sequence to dismantle her father's world from the inside out. 10 months had passed since the rain-slicked night the senator's daughter died in a confessional booth, and in her place, the architect had risen. The Abate estate, a fortress of limestone and ivy hidden in the rolling hills of Virginia, felt more like a sovereign nation than a residence. Inside the cavernous library, the air was cool and smelled of old leather, expensive espresso, and the sharp, ozone hum of high-end servers. Sia Rhee sat behind a desk of carved obsidian, the soft glow of 3 ultra-wide monitors reflecting in her eyes that no longer held the glassiness of trauma, but the sharp, analytical shimmer of a diamond. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit her like armor, her dark hair pulled back into a precise, lethal knot. She didn't look at the world through a lens of hope anymore. She looked at it as a series of interconnected nodes and leverage points. Her fingers danced across the keyboard with a rhythmic, percussive grace, navigating the encrypted back doors of the city's most secure institutions. On one screen, she was monitoring the real-time liquidation of a rival syndicate's offshore assets. On another, she was reviewing the private correspondence of a Supreme Court justice who had forgotten that every digital sin leaves a footprint. She had taken the raw, chaotic data of the Abate legacy and forged it into the most sophisticated intelligence network the capital had ever seen. From the shadow of the mezzanine, Nico watched her with a silent, dark adoration. He stood with his arms crossed, the ink on his neck fully visible, no longer a secret to be kept. He had taught her how to survive the darkness, but she had taught him how to own it. There was a profound, predatory pride in his gaze. He had once feared for her soul, but now he realized she had simply traded a fragile salvation for an ironclad sovereignty. The silence was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of a secure line. Sia didn't hesitate. She picked up the handset, her face remaining a mask of cold composure. "Hello, Lawrence," she said, her voice a level, terrifying calm. On the other end, the senator's breathing was ragged, the sound of a man watching his empire crumble in real time. He tried to speak of family, of apologies, of a way back, but Sia cut through the static like a blade. "Don't bother with the script. I've already rerouted your campaign contributions into a dormant account tied to the Irish mob. By tomorrow morning, the ethics committee won't be your biggest problem, survival will be." She leaned back, watching the final data packets transmit. "You told me I was a liability, Father. You were right. I am the liability that cost you everything. Checkmate." She ended the call without waiting for a response and looked up, meeting Nico's gaze with a terrifying clarity. They were an empire now, a duality of shadow and light that governed the city from the silence of the library. The world thought the storm had passed, but they didn't realize the storm had simply moved indoors. If you enjoyed this story of love, betrayal, and impossible choices, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more heart-stopping love stories just like this. And hey, turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next twist of passion and suspense.